Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful for You channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Taylor Hayes had never felt the halls of Forrester Creations vibrate with such tight, dangerous energy as they did the morning she returned to Los Angeles with a whisper of a smile, a secret tucked behind her calm eyes, and a brand new confidence striding through her posture. Because for the first time in years she wasn't coming home shaken, manipulated, or pulled like some emotional yo-yo between Ridge's waffling affections and Brooke's never-ending whirlwind of drama, but instead stepping back into the world she once tiptoed through with a firecracker certainty she hadn't felt since her earliest days as the beloved, brilliant psychiatrist who could soothe anyone but never seemed able to truly heal herself, until now, because now, now, she had a reason to lift her chin and savor the sharp inhale of every gasping Forrester and Logan who saw her walk through those glass doors holding the hand of a man no one had ever seen before, a man tall enough to cast a shadow over Ridge's ego, handsome enough to make Brooke blink twice, polished enough to make the boardroom assistants lean forward in their seats, and mysterious enough that even Steffi, who prided herself on her ability to read people within a fraction of a second, found herself taking a slow, measuring breath as Taylor squeezed the stranger's hand and announced with a voice smoother than silk stretched over steel that she would like everyone to meet her boyfriend, a single word that detonated through the space like an unexpected explosion, sending shockwaves directly into Ridge's chest as his jaw dropped, his heart skidded sideways, and his entire sense of the universe rearranged itself without his permission, because for all his proclamations that he wanted Taylor happy, wanted her thriving, wanted her free, he had never, not truly, imagined her showing up with someone new, someone real, someone who wasn't him, and certainly not a man who looked like the living embodiment of everything Ridge imagined Taylor deserved but secretly hoped she would never find again, because if Taylor had a new man then she didn't need him, and if she didn't need him then all the unspoken fantasies he kept tucked in the back drawers of his mind, the ones he never admitted existed, not to Brooke, not to Steffi, not to himself, would disintegrate in the bright, unforgiving daylight of Taylor's newfound joy, a joy she wore with the kind of effortless grace that told everyone she wasn't playing games, wasn't bluffing, wasn't trying to make Ridge jealous, because the truth shimmered in her eyes. She was simply done chasing him, done waiting for him, done standing in the shadow of the destiny he used as an excuse every time he ran back to Brooke, done forgiving him so easily that even he had begun to forget what her forgiveness cost her. And with this new man's arm steady around her waist, Ridge felt for the first time what it meant to lose her, not because he had chosen someone else, but because she had finally chosen herself, chosen someone who looked at her with unshakable admiration, someone who knew her brilliance not as a burden but as a gift, someone who made her laugh, really laugh, in a way none of the Forresters had seen her do in years, which only deepened the shock when Taylor introduced him as Dr. Marcus Hale, a fellow psychiatrist, renowned globally for trauma research, charming enough to disarm an army, and already effortlessly attuned to Taylor's subtle rhythms, standing with the kind of protective confidence that made Ridge's blood run hot with confusion, jealousy, insecurity, and a hint of panic, all of which he tried desperately to swallow as Brooke stepped forward with that bright, brittle politeness she used whenever she sensed Ridge spiraling, offering a too-sweet welcome to Forrester Creations that carried the slight tremor of her trying to calculate whether Marcus was a temporary rebound or a threat with staying power, and meanwhile Steffi practically sparkled with delight, throwing her arms around her mother and whispering that she looked radiant, glowing, powerful, words Taylor absorbed with soft gratitude because she knew how much her daughter had wanted her to move past the heartbreak, the years of emotional back and forth that had worn them all thin, and yet even Steffi, as elated as she was, couldn't help sliding her gaze toward her father to see the crack running straight through his composure, a crack that widened dramatically when Taylor leaned in and kissed Marcus, not a polite greeting kiss, not a nervous peck, but a warm, confident, intentionally unmistakable kiss that settled any doubt about whether this was real, and Ridge felt his entire throat tighten because that was his Taylor, the woman he thought would always, somewhere deep down, belong to him, and now she was kissing someone else inside his family company, in front of his family, in front of his world, a moment so destabilizing that even Brooke's fingers twitched slightly, sensing the tectonic plates shift beneath her and Ridge both, and the room hushed into a heavy silence right before Taylor, with that signature blend of compassion and unflinching honesty, announced that she wanted everyone to know she was happy, genuinely happy, and that she hoped they could welcome Marcus just as warmly as she had been welcomed back into her own sense of strength, because this wasn't a game or a ploy or revenge but simply her life moving forward, though the small, knowing glint in her eyes revealed that yes, maybe, just maybe, it was a little bit delicious too. Watch Ridge struggle, not because she wanted to hurt him but because for once she wasn't the one breaking, and Ridge, who had spent so many years believing he would always be the center of her emotional orbit whether he chose Brooke or Taylor or neither, suddenly found himself adrift as Marcus extended a hand to him with polite confidence, and Ridge shook it numbly, staring at the man who had walked into Taylor's life and given her a peace Ridge had never managed to sustain for more than a few months at a time, and when Marcus complimented Ridge's design work, with genuine admiration, not competitor's arrogance, Ridge felt something unexpected twist inside him, because the man was not only handsome, composed, intelligent, and generous but also undeniably likable, which for Ridge somehow made everything 10 times worse, and as the day stretched on with meetings, quiet gossip, subtle glances, and Taylor comfortably nestled at Marcus's side, Ridge's spiraling inner jealousy became impossible to hide, building until he finally cornered Taylor in the design office with a desperate, cracking voice, demanding to know why she hadn't told him she was seeing someone, why she hadn't prepared him, why she'd blindsided him like this, and Taylor, after a long, calm breath, delivered the most devastatingly gentle blow of all by explaining that his reaction, this belief that he should have been warned, that her life should somehow factor around his comfort, was exactly why she had kept her new relationship private, because she needed a chance to grow without him hovering in the emotional doorway of her healing, and as Ridge struggled to respond, Taylor offered the softest, kindest truth she had ever spoken to him. Ridge, you lost me a long time ago. You just never noticed, a statement that shattered him so thoroughly he couldn't speak, not even as she walked past him with Marcus waiting just outside, his hand extended the way Ridge wished his own had been for her all those times he'd run back to Brooke. And as Taylor left the room with her new man, laughing, radiant, fully alive, Ridge finally realized that this wasn't temporary, wasn't performative, wasn't a rebound. It was his worst fear and his deepest regret woven into one, because Taylor wasn't trying to make him jealous. Ridge Forrester realized that, for the first time in decades, he wasn't having to choose between Taylor and Brooke because Taylor had already made the decision and it wasn't him. She had, however, completely, utterly, devastatingly, leaving him standing alone in the design office of the very empire he once used to keep both women at arm's length. Ridge Forrester could barely breathe that night as he sat alone in the dim glow of the Forrester office, replaying every second of Taylor's triumphant return in a desperate attempt to make sense of how he had become the man left standing on the wrong side of a closed door. Because for years he had been the epicenter of emotional gravity around which Taylor's devotion orbited, a quiet constant he never fully appreciated until the moment she stepped into the room holding someone else's hand, and now, hours after she had left the building with Marcus at her side, Ridge still felt the ghost of that moment crushing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake, a humiliation mixed with heartbreak, a sickening cocktail of jealousy and regret simmering under his skin, and the longer he sat stewing in it, the more he realized the world he thought he controlled had slipped away while he wasn't looking, and that thought was so destabilizing he didn't know whether to lash out, collapse, pretend indifference, or confess everything he had never dared say, but before he could decide, the door opened and Brooke stepped inside, her expression softened with a blend of concern and fear, because she knew the look in Ridge's eyes. She had seen it before when Caroline married Thorne, when Taylor first re-entered his life, when destiny wavered for a single heartbeat, and now she recognized the same panic twisting beneath Ridge's carefully rehearsed stoicism, so she approached him cautiously, asking whether he was all right, and Ridge responded with a bitter, humorless laugh, admitting that he didn't know what he was anymore because everything had changed in one afternoon, and Brooke, trying so hard to appear supportive, gently suggested that maybe he was just startled, maybe Marcus wouldn't last, maybe Taylor was simply caught up in the excitement of something new, but Ridge snapped back with uncharacteristic sharpness that this wasn't a fling, wasn't some rebound fantasy, because Taylor didn't look like someone pretending, she looked settled, centered, happy, and the fact that Brooke tried to talk him out of seeing that only intensified the suffocating sense that he had been lying to himself about how deeply Taylor still mattered to him, and Brooke, stung but still fighting to hold her composure, reminded him that she was supposed to be his future, the one he loved, the one he always returned to, and Ridge felt a bolt of guilt cut through his chest because Brooke was right. He had vowed himself to her yet again, but the truth rising in him refused to be silenced, and the more he tried to push it down, the louder it screamed that he had taken Taylor for granted in ways he never should have, treating her heart like a revolving door he could pass through whenever destiny hiccuped, and now that door was closed, bolted, and guarded by a man who seemed to understand Taylor in ways Ridge never fully had, which left Ridge shaking, restless, unable to sit still. As he finally blurted out the admission Brooke feared the most, that seeing Taylor with someone else felt like losing something he didn't realize he expected to always have. And Brooke's eyes darkened with a storm of jealousy and betrayal, because she had tolerated years of Ridge drifting between the two of them, but this, Ridge pining after Taylor again, threatened to reopen wounds she had barely managed to stitch shut, and before she could speak, the office door opened once more and Steffi stepped inside, her tone sharp and her presence bracing as she announced that she needed to speak with Ridge alone, and Brooke bristled but Steffi's stare left no room for negotiation, so Brooke exited with thin lips and stiff shoulders while Steffi closed the door behind her, turning to her father with a fury she hadn't felt since the days when Thomas spiraled so far she feared losing him forever, and she demanded to know what Ridge thought he was doing, chasing after emotional ghosts while Taylor was finally healing, because Steffi had watched her mother for years try to be everything Ridge needed, bending herself into shapes no one should bend into, just to prove she was worthy of a man who could never make up his mind, and now, with Taylor thriving beside Marcus, Steffi refused to let Ridge destabilize her again, but Ridge protested, insisting that he wasn't trying to sabotage anything, that he just wanted to understand, to process, to talk, but Steffi cut him off with a brutal truth. Dad, Mom owes you nothing, not her explanations, not her warnings, not her heartbreak, and Ridge, normally so sure of himself, suddenly felt like a chastised child as Steffi explained that Marcus was good for Taylor, really good, and that her mother deserved a man who didn't flip-flop like a confused teenager with 2 prom dates, a man who saw her worth without needing decades of reminders, and as Ridge's chest constricted under the weight of her words, he whispered that he wasn't trying to take Taylor away from Marcus, though even he didn't quite believe that, but Steffi saw the denial for what it was and told him plainly that if he couldn't support Taylor's happiness, the least he could do was stay out of the way, because Steffi would not let anyone, not even her father, fracture her mother's newfound peace, and Ridge, gutted by the realization that even his daughter was prepared to defend Taylor from him, sank back into his chair as Steffi stormed out, leaving him alone once again with only the echo of his daughter's disappointment ringing in his ears. And meanwhile, across town at Il Giardino, Taylor and Marcus sat in a quiet corner booth laughing over shared stories from their pasts, stories Ridge had never heard because he had never taken the time to ask, and as Marcus watched Taylor speak with passion about her work, her children, her triumphs and traumas, he reached across the table and took her hand with a tenderness that made Taylor's heart swell in ways she had convinced herself were impossible, and she told him softly that it felt strange to be this happy again, this free, this unburdened, and Marcus assured her that she deserved every ounce of joy she had ever been denied, his gaze steady and unwavering as he promised not to let her shrink herself ever again, not for anyone, and especially not for a man who only recognized her value when someone else saw it too, and Taylor felt a poignancy wash over her, because part of her knew Ridge was reeling, but another part, the part she had always silenced, finally didn't care, because for the first time in far too long she felt like she was living for herself rather than for the expectations of the man who had broken her heart more times than she allowed herself to admit, and outside the restaurant a familiar figure lurked in the shadows, Ridge himself, drawn to the location without even meaning to, watching Taylor through the window as she laughed with Marcus, his stomach twisting with a sharp, visceral ache that reminded him of watching Caroline dance with Thorne decades earlier, and he hated the feeling, hated that he had become the outsider in his own story, the man on the sidewalk looking in at a life that might have been his if he had chosen differently, if he had listened more, if he had fought harder. But as Taylor leaned into Marcus, Ridge realized with a clarity that stole his breath that this wasn't a life that might have been, it was a life that was never his to begin with, not truly, not permanently. Not once he let Taylor slip through his fingers year after year until she finally learned to close her head around her own heart instead of placing it in his, and Ridge, overwhelmed, stepped back from the glass, swallowed hard, and whispered into the night air a truth he had never spoken aloud. I lost her, while inside, Taylor, unaware of the figure watching her, simply smiled at Marcus with a warmth Ridge had once taken for granted, a warmth she no longer wasted on anyone who didn't earn it. Ridge didn't sleep that night, not even for a moment, pacing the darkened living room of the Forrester mansion with the restless tension of a man who had finally realized the consequences of his own indecision, because every time he closed his eyes he saw Taylor smiling at Marcus, leaning into him, glowing with the kind of light Ridge used to believe only he could draw out of her, and the truth of how wrong he'd been tormented him until dawn painted pale streaks across the sky, and by then he could no longer resist the growing need to see her again, to try to explain himself, to try to repair something he wasn't even sure she wanted repaired anymore. So he drove to her house without calling, without thinking, simply propelled by instinct and desperation, but when he arrived he froze in the doorway because Marcus was already there, barefoot in Taylor's kitchen, making coffee like he belonged in the rhythm of her mornings, and the sight of him so comfortable, so woven into Taylor's space, hit Ridge like a punch he wasn't prepared for, but Marcus only greeted him calmly, politely, with the same unshakable composure that made Ridge feel both furious and inferior, and Taylor, hearing the voices, stepped out of the hallway in soft morning light, her hair still a little tousled, her expression exasperated the moment she realized Ridge had shown up uninvited, and she told him in a steady voice that now wasn't a good time, but Ridge, unraveling by the second, insisted he needed to talk to her, that he needed her to hear him, that last night he saw her at the restaurant, and Taylor's face hardened instantly at the admission, because the last thing she wanted was to be watched, monitored, surveilled like a teenage girl sneaking out on a date, and she asked, no, demanded, why he thought it was acceptable to follow her, but Ridge tried to backpedal, saying it wasn't like that he hadn't meant to spy, that he was just walking by and saw her through the window, but Taylor cut him off sharply, telling him that for once, just once, she needed him to tell the truth instead of the version that made him look better, and Ridge, cornered, finally admitted he went there because he couldn't stop thinking about her, because seeing her with Marcus was a shock, because he wasn't ready to watch her move on so completely, and the words spilled out of him with the frantic energy of a man who didn't realize he'd been drowning until it was too late, but Taylor stood still, unmoved, letting him talk until he ran out of excuses and breath. And only then did she speak, her voice quiet yet razor-sharp, telling him that she understood he was hurting, she understood he was surprised, but none of that gave him the right to insert himself into her life again, not after everything she had gone through because of him, not after the years of emotional tug-of-war he had put her and Brooke through, not after choosing someone else time and time again and expecting Taylor to just stay, waiting in the background, and Ridge instinctively reached for her hand, but she stepped back, and that single step hurt him more than any words ever could, yet before he could respond Marcus moved beside Taylor, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but protectively, like a man who respected her boundaries enough to help reinforce them, and he said calmly that Taylor didn't owe Ridge anything, not a conversation, not an apology, not a rationalization for her happiness. And Ridge's nostrils flared with jealousy at the ease with which Marcus spoke for her, but Taylor didn't correct him or shy away. She simply looked at Marcus with appreciation that twisted something deep in Ridge's chest, and then she said the words Ridge had been dreading since the moment she introduced Marcus, Ridge. I'm moving forward. I'm not waiting for you anymore, and the finality in her voice made Ridge feel like the floor had dropped out beneath him, so he scrambled, desperately telling her that she couldn't mean that this thing with Marcus was new, that maybe she needed time to think, but Taylor almost laughed, because for once she was the one in control, and she told him that she had been thinking for years, thinking through every heartbreak he caused, every time he chose Brooke and left Taylor picking up the shattered pieces alone, and she confessed that she used to believe Ridge was the great love of her life, but she had grown, evolved, healed, and Marcus had shown her that the world didn't have to revolve around Ridge Forrester's chaos, that she could have peace and joy without bargaining with her self-worth, and as Ridge's voice cracked, actually cracked, he begged her not to shut him out, claiming he still loved her, but those words, which once held the power to bend Taylor's entire life, now fell flat, because she no longer trusted the version of love Ridge offered, the version that always came with an asterisk, a contingency, a guarantee that Brooke would eventually reappear like a gravitational force he could never resist, and Taylor said so plainly, telling him that love without consistency wasn't love at all, and Marcus placed a gentle hand on her back in silent support, which only made Ridge feel more excluded, more furious, more terrified of losing her forever. So in a last-ditch effort he asked her what she wanted him to do, what he had to say to make this right, but Taylor shook her head sadly and whispered that there was nothing he could do, because the woman who once would have done anything to be with him no longer existed. She had finally chosen herself, and Marcus was simply a beautiful part of that choice, not the reason for it, and Ridge, heartbroken, frustrated, overwhelmed, turned away with tears burning at the edges of his eyes, muttering that Marcus would never love her the way he did, but Taylor replied softly, firmly, devastatingly, that Marcus already did, and in a far healthier way, and as Ridge left the house, collapsing into the driver's seat of his car with shaking hands, Taylor closed the door behind him with a deep exhale, leaning into Marcus as he wrapped his arms around her, telling her he was proud of her strength, and Taylor, for the first time in decades, finally believed she deserved that pride.